Hello, everybody. I hope you have enjoyed the coffee and the cookie. And we will try to start now. My name is Kristina Lilja, and I'm from Department of Economic History, Uppsala University. And I'm very happy to have been asked to take care of this roundtable. And as you can see, there is quite many researchers, more than people than, no, as many. So I will just say very short something about how we will organize this. And my plan is that I give the word to all of you, 5 minutes each. And before you do your short speech about the market as a concept, before you start with saying things you have planned to say, I would like you also to introduce yourself so we know where you're from and who you are and so on. So when you have talked for 5 minutes each, you could react on your talks. And when we feel that we are finished here, I will give the word to the rest of the audience here today. So I will start with giving the word to Montserrat Carbonell. And I don't know if you want to come up here. The floor is yours, if you want to sit down. You decide yourself.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Montserrat Carbonell of the University of Barcelona, and I teach a lot of years in the Department of Economic History, but my approach is social and economic and demographic history. And my subject of research is the survival strategies, and I study pledges, household, welfare, public soap, and all this. In the end of 18th century and the beginning of 19th century. But now, today, I want to say something perhaps useful for the debate. Well, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to this workshop. Well, I try to present some ideas about the credit at the margins and the connections between the formal sector and the informal sector of financial system. And my approach is the south of Europe and urban areas. The pawning of pledges was one of the forms of access to loans for working class people. And I want to stressing three aspects here. And the first is the flow of financial resources between the formal sphere and the informal spheres of financial system. There is a flow between the spheres. The debate on usury and the restriction of the interest rate marked the second half of 18th century and the first half of 19th century in Spain. Did the reduction in the interest rate protect the poorest? The sources analyzed show quite the opposite. The restriction of the interest rate reduced the funds deposited and consequently the credit. At times of less liquidity of the institution, the loans were aimed at the safer clientele, those with more valuable guarantees and with a better reputation. In certain situations, people appeared who attracted resources and who could be informal lenders. The flow of resources between the formal sector and the informal sector was revelated in this example of Teresa Vidal, a woman in the year 1805. The second aspect I'd want to explain is the expulsion of the poorest from the formal banking system. One of the mechanisms used by the institution Monte de Piedad is the institution of pledge, used by the institution to avoid the risk that the loan would not be repaid and consequently that the pledge would have to be sold in public auction, was to exhaustively assess the possibilities that each pledge had of being sold in auction. In this respect, the regulations induce the appraiser to give a very low price to those objects which would probably be more difficult to sell in a public auction. And thus, the poorest, who tended to have the least interesting pledges for the institution, were gradually expelled from it. The mechanism used consisted of obliging the appraiser to cover the difference between the loan granted and not repaid and the result of the sale of the pledge in public auction. It was the appraiser who had to pay. This was an effective system to oblige the valuer to value the pledges of less value lower. Consequently, the poor were expelled from the formal institution, formal microfinance sector, to the traditional lenders. These practices interfered with the perfect credit market. And the third aspect, finally, the analysis of network of working class credit institutions, Montes de Piedad, Montepios, which emerged in mid-19th century, in 1840s, shows that in the formal credit, the pledge in the formal credit for pledge, the market was segmented. It depends of kind of pledge, this segmentation. The institutions specialized in small loans with a small value are institutions more feminine, like Monte de Piedad in 1840, with more than 70% of its clients being women. And the other institution in the same city, in the same place and the same time, Montepío Barcelonès, is an institution of pawning for pledge with 70% of men. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We give an applause, I think. And I give the word to Bruce Dahlgaard. Do you want to sit down?
Well, it's very humbling to be here amongst so many distinguished people. It's much easier sitting up there and watching you than sitting here and being watched. I'm probably the only individual here from a four-year liberal arts college, although that I know some of you have graduated from such places. With that, I'm also very humbled, but honored to have been invited. When I got the directive from you about talking about markets, I couldn't help but recall the discussion that was triggered when Polanyi wrote his book, The Great Transformation, and set off a rather long-standing debate about where markets come from. He suggesting that they were a relatively recent phenomenon, something with which I don't agree. And I enjoyed reading Deidre McCloskey. I knew Deidre when she was Donald. McCloskey as she attempted to rebut what Polanyi had to say. And that led me into North and some of his ideas. And I think that the point that I want to make as we talk about markets, and it started to come out a bit in the last session, this whole discussion about early modern finance seems as though it needs to be embedded in the societal and cultural context on which these exchanges are taking place. I thought the question about the fact that in Stockholm there were many young women who were living with someone but weren't married is an illustration of the fact that the cultural context can inform or undermine our understanding about the way in which informal interactions work. So the message that I'm trying to bring into our discussion is that as we talk about financial markets, I tend to think that markets have existed for centuries, maybe not in the sense that we economists typically think of them as using a price mechanism to allocate. But I think there are any number of ways in which markets can serve that function, even if prices are not predominant. So I think we need to spend some time thinking about where the market is embedded and how those factors influence the functioning of the markets. I also think that as we move forward in these discussions, that there are many things that we are finding out about pre-modern markets that probably can help inform our understanding about contemporary markets. As they've gotten more sophisticated, in a way, it seems to me, they have actually become more imperfect, even though we would probably argue that it was the perfection of the formal market that replaced the informal market. But as I reflect upon circumstances that have occurred in the last few years, it seems to me that those imperfections that exist today are exceed very far the imperfections that existed in informal markets. And the question that I ask is, why is that? And in part, I'd like us to discuss whether or not the relationships, the knowledge that people had one of another in an earlier period helped to allow these transactions to occur more effectively, maybe more efficiently than we would normally think of. And that the very formal markets that exist today, because we have created such a separation between borrowers and lenders, may in fact not be functioning particularly well because we've lost the human interaction or the human awareness. So I guess I sound a lot like Douglas North here, and I don't apologize for that. So I hope we can bring some of this discussion into our conversation about markets, how they function, and how they've evolved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now it's time for Peter Eriksson. Do you want to come up here?
No, I'm fine here. So,
okay. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation to come here. My name is Peter Eriksson. I'm from the Department of History at Uppsala University. I'm currently working on a project which explores the emergence and development of early financial markets in Sweden in the 18th century. I'm not an economist, so this sort of scared me a little bit that I should talk about markets. I'll just say a few things about them that matters to me and my work, and see if that has anything to do with. I think that has to do with other things as well. Okay, so my interest is similar to what Bruce said here. I'm interested in how to analyze markets in how they function in contexts. and in particular in relationship to the state, and how that state impacted society. In other words, I am interested in the political economy of financial markets. One basic assumption or point of departure is that there are no free or independent markets. For a financial market to be able to exist, it needs some type of, it needs to be subject to some type of legislative regulations. It's not only enforcement, but, and usually governments in early modern Europe connected taxation, custom duties to financial markets. They were working sort of within the same system. The idea here is being that the state does not really intervene in markets, but states and markets have historically developed in symbiosis and generally mutually strengthen each other. One should take, for instance, the more practical example that merchants were often contractors to the state, that the state was one of the main economic motors of early modern society. Their military, their army, in particular the navy, costed a lot of money. Many of the merchants were contractors. They delivered military supplies to the state, and they also provided the state with the credits in order to purchase their goods. And later on, as the states started to issue government bonds, they were the prime investors in these bonds, and they also dealt with them on secondary markets. So, states also, in early modern times, seem to have the capacity to create markets and to regulate them in such a way that they redistribute resources in society. One example is a state, or often a town magistrate, which is basically the same thing here, that issued bonds which are served by excise taxes on everyday goods, such as bread and beer. They are prime examples of a redistribution of wealth from poor people who need to buy food to wealthy investors in the form of interest payments. It is possible that such flows also can run another way if the investors here were, for instance, charitable organizations but the thing is here that states can use markets to redistribute resources. States also tend to have the capacity to integrate underdeveloped informal or financial markets by issuing financial instruments that are intended to circulate among anonymous strangers. And if things work out well for the state, they might be able to replace personal trust between buyer and seller with the trust in a political system. Such instruments also has the capacity to transcend geographical obstacles. The crucial question, of course, is there really a general trust in the commitments of the state? Which, of course, brings us to Northern Weingast's classical study from '89. I would like to argue that the credibility of the commitments of a state is not necessarily a question of formal constitutional arrangements. It is rather a question of which social groups in society that are granted access to the political process, and thus which economic interests are catered for. So the state cannot be seen here in relationship to markets as a monolith, but rather as an area where some sort of political struggle over resources take place, and the state, of course, also has then the capacity to implement their decisions. For instance, if we draw from our research, there are strong evidence that the creditors' interests were carefully guarded under an autocratic regime. In Sweden, say in the 1710s, whereas under the subsequent parliamentary regime, the state partially defaulted on their obligations and thereby targeted the social groups, primarily the peasantry, who were politically marginalized. In the first case, the regime needed to secure further loans from large segments of the population in order to sustain a policy of continued warfare. In the second case, a new regime that was not in the need of further credits since all belligerent ambitions had been cancelled. So we need to take into account also the political ambitions of the states when analyzing them in relationship to markets. States can also, through regulations, integrate financial markets with other markets. In our research, we study how a market for financial instruments emerged as a result of a huge release of token money that was partially exchanged for so-called insurance notes. These happened in Sweden in 1719. These notes were then required as payments for custom duties on all foreign trade. And this gave rise to a secondary market in which tens of thousands of transactions were conducted over a period of more than 45 years. On these markets, profits were made by merchants and other intermediaries. And the design of this market was at least partially a political motivated compensation for merchants and traders for their initial losses in that partial default of the token money that I just mentioned. Yeah, that's pretty much what I had.
Thank you very much. So, I will, so, as perhaps some of you have noticed that there are more people in front of you than in the program. And one of them is Yoso Abbas. The floor is yours.
Yeah, unlucky for me that I was in the new description. I'm a PhD student in Uppsala University. I'm currently writing my thesis, and I'm working in Håkan Lindgren's project, Informal Financial Markets in 19th Century Sweden, estimates based on microdata. The research I'm doing is on Malmö's credit market throughout the period 1850 to 1900. And my focus is on social and geographical structures in that credit market and how economic crisis affected these structures. I'm also using a different source than most of you here. I'm using petition protocols instead of probate records. And these protocols are basically petitions to the county registry from creditors of outstanding debt. And these petitions could be made from both formal and informal creditors. So one of the things I want to bring forward for discussion is basically in my research, the majority of credit was done or given by trade merchants. And this is not very unique for me and not very unique for Scania, but these trade merchants were highly active across the county and its borders, especially compared to earlier studies using probate records, because it's not seen in that way earlier. And that activity is basically both a product of their occupation as grain merchants and the surrounding principal trade and industry, which is agriculture. So the first point I would like to bring up for discussion is the geography and social structure of that market. And what I mean by that is the geography, which is highly specific for each paper presented here, is the dependence on social composition in the region I study, and the region studied by you. Thus, are the deviations and differences in the markets comparable, or is the social composition altering what the markets constitute and how they function? And secondly, should the informal and formal credit be viewed as a part of a larger market, and as they in certain regions incorporate different geographies? So basically in Scania and in Malmö, you have, at least from my point of view of the petition protocols, different distances in how big that geography is. The second point I would like to discuss is basically the types of credit and how it is repaid. And the distinction is in modern terms a matter of interpretation and ultimately a matter of understanding the action of agents. As many of these debts were settled in kind and bought even on credit, the principal action of agents that needs to be considered is their necessity in actions and equally the shortage of liquidity. Thus, the point I'm trying to make is, as Carol mentioned before, the deferred debt payments and debt settled in kind, should it be included in our understanding of credit markets, and does this change the concept of the market if you include it in a sense, especially credit markets as we see them? Yeah, that's basically it.
Okay, thank you. And Susanna Fellman, do you want to?
Yeah, I want to stand.
You want to use the floor?
Yes, I haven't prepared any PowerPoints, but I rather prefer this microphone to those ones. Yes, I am Susanna Fellman. I am professor of business history in University of Gothenburg, and I'm also very, very happy to be invited here, and because I'm not doing any, I mean, not because, but to explain, I'm not doing financial markets, especially and so on, but Håkan has always been some kind of a mentor for me when I was younger, and so I was very pleased to be able to talk today. But as I said, I'm no financial market specialist, and not study wealth or so, but I do study markets. I mean, markets are in the core of business and economic history, but also more concretely I study competition and cartels and how they function and how they are regulated over time. So this is, and especially business and government relations, which are very key in these issues. So many of the questions we can also transfer to this. So, I mean, questions about free markets and the role of market regulation. Is there too much regulation or too little regulation? And how shall we find some kind of efficient regulation, making markets function as best as we want them to? And who decides on what is a good and well-functioning market? So in that way, the question about market is, of course, also very in the core of my research. I was a bit scared when I read the title, and I also asked Christina, and what do you want us to talk about, and to define the market concept, and I'm not going to define it here. And I mean, we have had definitions, these classical definitions already up here, and I think that actually, why should we fix anything that is not broke? I mean, it's not the definition that is important, it's more that we understand how markets work and how we can increase our understanding of how markets work, which I think is the core of perhaps the discussion here. And I think that both Bruce and especially Peter rose many issues that I would like to discuss on later on. But also how actors work on the market, how do they behave on the market, how do they transact, and so on. And by doing this, which I think has been very much up for in many papers today, is one also of the cores of how economic and business historians can contribute to the discussions of the functioning of the modern markets as well. And as some here already was mentioned, that in a way that the imperfect, or what we think from a modern, not perhaps we, but people from the modern perspective think that are well modern, very well described and well regulated markets, and they are still not always functioning well. So can we learn something from these more informal markets, more ad hoc and fragmented markets, which to provide stability and so on. Another thing which I think that we exchanged some notes or points with Martin Shanahan here when we came up from Gothenburg yesterday, and so I want he has many good slides to show. He's going to show some slides, but I think also one of the things that has been up here and which is also an important question, and this is how markets and market behavior change, and that is of course also in the core among the business and economic historians. And then we have, of course, the technology changes, financial innovations, new instruments, and tools to regulate. And that is what we actually, with Martin, has been studying in the competition policy, is an instrument for regulation. I'm not going to talk about it here, but how it worked in different contexts. And then we also have the discussion about how similar institutions might work very differently in different contexts, or at least on the surface they looked as the same institution, even though they are called the same, but they might not, when we scrape on the surface, they are not the same institution overall. So there are lots of things that need to be really focused and digged in and drill into the details, which are typical for people in this room. And then, of course, the role of the actors in this change process, the state, but also the individuals, the firms, and the authorities. And what we also, with Martin, has been studying is how authorities work in implementing the regulation, which affects how actually the market works. I mean, if a regulation is there, but it's not implemented, then it doesn't affect the market very much. So, as a final, I think I'm probably overdoing this again, but a few notes which I also have taken up from listening to you today, and which I think that is very important, and now I didn't remember your name. Yeah. Yes, was you were talking about the geography, because I think this is also something which is extremely important. Where are the markets, but also what are the boundaries of the market? Are they extending over time? Yes, they are. And what effects does this have? Does it make it more stable? Does it make more efficient? Or is it actually one of the reasons because of the instability? And then, of course, also the state capacity, which is extremely important over time. And then also the layers of the markets, that they were over national, international, but also local, and they exist at the same time. It's not going from the local to the global, but there are links all the time and layers all the time, and the connection and interactions between these layers, which I think are also very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanna, and I think we have to introduce you new, Martin Shanahan. And you want to use a prop? Yes.
One of the advantages of standard system across the world, isn't it? Like the others, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak. It's wonderful to be here and meet so many people who are interested in probate records. I think I said to someone when I first did my PhD, I thought I was the only person on the planet who was interested in probate records, and certainly my friends looked at me very strangely. It's also an opportunity to meet someone who's responsible for me completing my PhD, and that's Carol Shamus, because I found one of your articles deep in the libraries at Flinders University on a hot summer's day when I was thinking that this was the end. So thank you. So a long way to get here, but thank you very much. As Susanna said, we both, I have to work out how to make this work now. We both got very nervous yesterday trying to work out what we were going to say that was different from anybody else. So I'm going to skip over a couple of these slides simply because they say the obvious very quickly. We were, sorry, not speaking close enough to the microphone, about the difference between capital and money markets was something that I think is evolving. we've already spoken briefly about Polanyi and the debate. It seems to me that in the discussions today, what we have been talking about is that attribute of the connection between human beings. One of the things I say to my students in Economics 101 is humans invented markets. They sometimes don't actually get that. They think that they've been given. And so when we look at human beings in societies at different points of time, we're looking at different ways of forming those relationships, and markets is one of those things. I think Polanyi reminds us of that. But what I wanted to do, and the thing that I wanted to basically focus on, was this definition that's given by the sociologist Callan. I thought I'd be in a room with quite a few more economists, so I had my armour suit on. But what his definition does is that he really tries to open up all of the different aspects of what is involved with a market. So what they do in terms of organising conception, production, circulation of goods, what are the elements that go into that creation, and perhaps the most controversial one, the one I was waiting for something to be thrown, was talking about the confrontation of power between the people who are buying and selling. I've broken this down a little bit more because when we were talking about, well, what should we talk about today, it was about what changes over time with markets. If you pull apart that definition, which I've done here, these are the different elements of a market, all of which change over time and which are different in different societies in different periods of time. And so in terms of things to think about, but also in things to look for or things to attempt to measure, we've got the rules and conventions, which we've had already spoken about a little bit, but technical devices by which those interactions occur, even how elements are measured in the market, whether it's by weight, whether it's by value, whether it's by gold, whether it's by nanoseconds of a machine, the competencies and the skills of the people who are involved in that market. And we've heard today some of the debate about just literacy and some of those basic elements, the degree of technical and scientific knowledge, the space where that relationship occurs, whether it's in the village square, whether it's in the parish hall, whether it's in the courtroom, whether it's in the stock exchange, and the process by which that actually works itself out in the end, whether it's by fisticuffs in a Western, or whether it's by one artificially intelligent machine talking to another artificially intelligent machine and doing the transfer in a fraction of a second. These are all elements of markets that we would recognise as created by us to facilitate interactions between us, but which change over time. And then finally, because I don't think you can talk about these sorts of things without mentioning Douglas North's work about the costs of these changes, I'll put him in on the bottom line, not because he's at the bottom, but because it's another element not to forget. So our thoughts were that historically we're all looking at aspects of these things, and we need to be aware of how many different dimensions can be involved when we're talking about markets. And that's obvious, that's said, that's Polanyi, and that's me finished.
So thank you very much. And now I would like to introduce Laurence Fontaine.
I'm an historian, but I moved 10 years ago in the sociology department for the challenge of the discussion. And I first studied peddlers and mountain societies, which I realized they were totally involved in credit networks and they were paying, not paying. And because of that, I went on studying credit. And the first approach was the poor needs credit. That's the first thing you need. So how do people respond to the need of the poor in credit. So basically, I've been studying peddlers, credit, market, and poverty. And this helps you to understand the kind of question, the three angles I'm going to address the market in these 5 minutes. The first one is to speak of the market in singular, the market. And then you need to have definition. If you go back to the definition that you find in the dictionary in the Middle Ages in France, the first definition states, the market is the fixing of a price after discussion. And I really underline after discussion, because this is what it is about. Afterward, they would incorporate the place in which the market stands. But if you're a bit familiar with Europe in early modern time, which was a status-based society, you immediately understand that the aristocrats are not going to discuss price, because they need to assert their authority and their preeminence in every acting of their lives. Therefore, the market is a dynamite stick under status-based society. And this is one of the main struggles all over early modern times. And so this is the first thing I wanted to stress. And it's a battle against the market in any kind of status-based society, be it based on politics. In the former Soviet society, they just couldn't stand the market, be it in a caste society. So there is really something which is at stake there. The second is to speak of the market in the plural. And then you need to study the different markets. And then you see immediately that they have different logics. They're not all working along the same logic. And especially the financial markets, they are first the fuel of the rest of the economy, and they work in contradiction with the rest of the other markets. Because the financial markets want to make profit, so they need to lower the cost of the working market and all kinds of other markets. So this is something to reflect on. And then the last point would be to say that it's a bit something that you've said, that the market is a stake. And when I was studying, poverty and market, I understood that you could write the history of the market in early modern time by saying that it's the history of the expulsion of the poor out of the market, so to speak. Now they're trying to get back again today. But so the market is a stake. And to understand, everybody wants to grab the market for itself. And then you have to understand, to study the rulers of the game, to whom they are designed for, who is losing, who is gaining, what the margin of that the people can play with those rules. And how does conflict are solved? What are the rules of the game to solve the conflict? And again, what are the punishments for economic delinquency? And well, it's all these kind of questions that I think that is really at the core of the study of the market. Singular, plural, and the market is a stake. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I give the word to Erik Lakama.
I could actually start with saying thanks for inviting me, despite I'm the director of the Institute for Economic and Business History Research in Stockholm, because I'm not an organizer of this conference. I could, if you like the conference, you shouldn't thank me, you should thank the organizers. And I don't do research on 18th century credit, but I do more recent stuff primarily on business history, but also some political economy work. But markets are important in these fields as well. And some of these classic topics have been already mentioned. When was markets established? What is a market? And I'm going to give some random thoughts on I probably can't answer the question what a market is. And I think there are lots of definitions. Some of them are not very useful. Some are somewhat more useful, but they don't capture what this is all about. And I could go back to what the major field of economics. the economist Ludwig von Mises wrote a book in 1948 or something called Human Action. And he also suggested that you should rename the subject economics into human action, because economics is human action. Okay, that makes sense, but it didn't happen. We still call it economics. Because if there are other subjects that are also human action, we could get rid of like history, sociology, psychology, anthropology, political science, and call that human action as well. And then the term is not very good, because there is still a value to talk about economics compared to, say, psychology or history. So, and the same goes with markets. So you could argue that markets have always existed. That is correct in one respect. Someone, I actually forgot who said it, that what could be a defining characteristics of like modern humans is the ability and propensity to barter and to make intertemporal agreements, which will allow markets. So probably markets existed for like 300,000 years or something. We could also say that the market is only like a Walrasian auction, and then we probably can't find any markets. So it's something in between. We need to be quite accurate what we mean. I don't think that we should say that this is outside the market or inside the market, because it doesn't really make sense. In business history, there's a concept called non-market strategy, which is like corporations do things to increase their profits or their long-term viability by acting outside the organized markets, but a non-market strategy is obviously on the political market, for example. So non-market strategy could be in market as well. We also talk about markets that are not dependent on explicit prices. We talk about marriage markets. Values exist, but we don't quote them in lists in newspapers or on web pages. So you could discuss, is this definition that prices are established the definition of a market? Yes, prices are established, but you can't see the prices explicitly. There are other markets that work in the same fashion. Further, you could also use the tools used to analyze, like what we call markets in everyday language, to analyze these markets, like the marriage market. That's possible. That's what you do in public choice analysis, which also makes sense. On the other hand, there are other economists or economic historians claiming that you could differentiate between market transaction and like command and control, like the quotient within a firm and outside a firm, which is contracts versus like coercion or top-down control, which also don't really make sense in all situations, because every market transaction have some degree of coercion, could be at least. Because you could also state, if you look at the establishment of a price, you could see, even though this is something that most people would, or probably no one, would call a market transaction, is that someone is pointing a gun at me and say, give me your wallet or I'll kill you. We could establish a price that my life is more valuable to me than to you, and your wallet is more important to you than me. We agree, the market clears. This is not a market transaction, but we established a price. So probably you should analyze markets in a different fashion and see, and you could also connect this to this, when did they emerge, when are market relevant as a tool, means of analysis of, for example, historical credit, is, for example, the degree of coercion. You could argue that a market transaction is entered voluntarily, which this robbery situation is not, because I didn't enter that voluntarily, he did, I didn't. Because I wanted to benefit from it. I might not benefit from it, but it's just about my intention to benefit from it. Then we have a market transaction. You could also see that market transaction needs to be uncoerced or voluntarily, which can't be, this definition can't be used of everything that we call markets today. We could also see that, for example, that markets, if you look at the Poligani definition of markets that were mentioned by Bruce, that markets are very recent phenomenon. This is probably not true in the sense that market exists. There are lots of examples of like market behavior long before the modern economy. That is pretty obvious. But we can see that we have different kinds of markets. We have like emergent order markets that have existed for yeah, I should say at least thousands of years. But we could have organized markets that are a more recent phenomenon. And we could see a switch from emergent ordered markets. We could have market-like transaction between what Polanyi would define as outside the markets. For example, these client-related transactions between, for example, a feudal lord and his vassal, which included a monetary transaction, a price, but it was not driven by normal market mechanisms. We could also see in households that you borrow from your father. Most people would not call that a transaction in a market, but it could be. It's definitely not an organized transaction, but we have organized markets as well, which is that. So these are my thoughts then. You don't find a clear definition, but you have some ideas what you should look for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now it's Martin Iversen.
It works?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay, so this is a late afternoon and a large panel, and I'm the last presenter, so I will really do my best to do it short. And in order to do that, I have cheated a little bit, like the people on TV when they have the chef's kitchen. I've already prepared some things over here. and you know, when I'm working at CBS, Copenhagen Business School, for too long, 18 years. No, I enjoy to be there. I've been there for 18 years, and at least half of the time I have been looking at Danish capitalism, trying to understand how Danish capitalism have developed over time. And obviously, if you look at capitalism, then the market concept is critical to understand. And spending this time on it, I have tried to come up over time, of course, with some sort of a concept, a model for understanding the changes of markets in capitalism. Usually I would use around 45 minutes at least to present this concept. Now I have late afternoon, 5 minutes, but I have cheated a bit, so that maybe that can help me. But the idea here is to look at two factors that are basically based upon the factors that are used in sort of the grounded economic theory for markets. One would be that any market you would look at between, so the horizontal here, between the restricted economic transactions and the unrestricted economic transactions. So you can take any market at any time, and then you can place it somewhere and such. You can say, I looked at the beer market in Copenhagen, and I could say it started completely unrestricted in the mid-19th century, and then it moved gradually towards becoming more restricted and then back again. So any market at any time, you can kind of move it in that direction. So this is obviously what people, neoliberal people who are interested in economics would be interested in looking at economic transactions. But as has also been mentioned earlier here, we should definitely, and this is the knowledge from economic sociology, and this is something I learned. I was at UC Berkeley and spending time with Neil Flickstein and his group on architecture of markets, that really this doesn't make sense. Of course there will be actors in markets, and there will be actors who are saying, well, you know, we will try to get emphasis. We will be the ones who are defining these economic transactions. So the other way we look at it will be between private actors and public actors, or between the private sector and the state. And combining these two kind of gives us sort of 4 different market opportunities. We can call we can start down here, the combination between unrestricted economic transactions and private actors, that we could call the bazaar economy. And that's what Neil Flickstein and other economic sociologists will say, this is utopia, this is not possible. There will always be movements out of that situation. Then you can have a combination in a market between a restricted economic transactions and strong private actors that we could call a cartel economy. So that would be a situation where we have very strong private actors making restrictions for the economic transactions, setting prices, making sure that it's difficult to have economic transactions. And as a third one, you could have a combination of restricted economic transactions and very strong public actors. And the sort of extreme of that situation would be a planned economy. So that's a very strong state, setting prices, setting output, and so on. And finally, and that's very interesting, you can think about a combination where you have economic transactions that are market-based, but at the same time you have a strong state, and that I think you can regard that as a common market situation. And I guess that's actually what the European Union is trying to do. So they are having the basic concept from the Treaty of Rome saying, well, we believe in markets, we believe in economic transactions that are market-based, but we also understand that we need very strong public actors in order to facilitate that. So we're not talking about sort of unregulation, but rather deregulation in a common market situation. Okay, back to Danish capitalism, and this will be my final words. Okay, Danish capitalism, early 19th century, kind of started in a place down here from the mid-19th century, and I believe that has to have a movement like this, moving, and what I'm really interested in, I think we should discuss in our panel now, is also the changes over time. What is it that makes this change, and which kind of differences are there between these interests, and what makes it possible to make these changes over time? And then, of course, the financial aspects. And the more I think about the financial aspects, the more I think it is something like this, that you can draw a line down here, and if you are up over here, you are in a coordinated market economy situation where you have more stability, less financial crisis. And the more you would be down this way, you will be in a what we could call financial capitalism situation. And that proved from history to be marked by financial crisis. And at least in the Danish case, we had financial crisis in 2008, and I would say that was somewhere down here where you had unrestricted markets, but you still had a public actor that was there, but not enough, and that created a financial crisis. And you also had financial crisis when you're somewhere here, down here. But when you're up here in this situation in the mid-20th century, complete regulation of the financial sector and no financial crisis whatsoever. Thank you so much for your attention this late afternoon.
So, thank you very much, all of you. Excellent work. And now I wonder if there is any of you who wants to say something to start with. Somebody?
So asked this, I thought, if financial markets
Could you please
were different. Are financial markets different? And so I just throw that into the mix for our discussion. We're talking about market as a concept, but as we specify financial markets, do we see distinctions between the way they function and the way other markets function? And if so, why?
That's a question thrown out, and we will see if anybody is interested to saying something. Laurence? Oh, sorry.
No, I'd like to say something about competing political economy. It's when in the beautiful design that you made, when I was contemplating the bazaar economy, I was thinking that in early modern time you had lots of bazaar economy because nothing was fixed. You couldn't, quality, quantity, all was uncertain. So in this kind of uncertainty, you need to have a bazaar economy. But at the same time, you had the gift economy, which was the aristocratic economy. And you know, this competing political economy, you could find them in lots of settings. So I found your design beautiful, but I'd like to see how they merge, how you could put on top of it another design. You would, you know, because these competing political economy are still at stake today, and I think it's very important to discuss that.
I think I can reply shortly to that I definitely agree. But I also think in your presentation you mentioned that the aristocracy would set the prices, right? So that is kind of a restriction on free economic transactions. So obviously also in medieval economy you had restrictions on economic transactions, but very much by private actors, I presume. Not so much on a concentrated or coordinating state. Would that be correct to say? So that would maybe place a medieval economy rather down in what is there labeled as something between bazaar economy and a cartel economy. Would that make sense to you?
We need to talk more.
We need to talk more. Okay, that's right. I agree.
And the other thing I'd like to say, I see that everybody around more or less quoted Polanyi, and I'm not quite sure I'm a Polanist, because if you look back. First, I think every economy is embedded. Economy is embedded today like it was before. So this part is different. And then I think we need to look at the people according to the context in which they were producing their thoughts. And Polanyi was writing during the rise of fascism, when there was that awful crisis of the 30s. And he was not understanding any longer what was going on in capitalist economy. And he was dreaming of another economy, which would be a socialist economy, which was not yet existing. And he sort of made a kind of surgery. And usually you have, as I said, markets are about discussion. So normally markets should go with democracy. But then it was not going any longer with democracy. So that was a big question. So it turned the democratic aspect toward the socialist that he was dreaming of, and he put, fascism, which was what's going on. So it's, I think, to better understand what Polanyi thinks and in what sense it is still important today. It's something which is interesting to me, because for me this is a French problem. Polanyi is a French problem. So I'm surprised to see that it is not only a French problem. Because, when he wrote, the question were not decolonization, were not women, were not the earth, and all this is the problem of today. So, just because, as everybody quoted Polanyi, I wanted to say something on that.
I give the word to Susanna.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I wanted just to make a quick question to Martin, if I understand. It might be that I have missed you. But I mean, as you talked about the stable market during the planned economy, and I mean, we have been discussing this a lot when we did the Nordic book. And I mean, yes, but it ended in crisis. So I fully agree that we should study those. Well, in the Finnish case, yes, yeah, that was actually the long regulation that ended in a crisis. But then the question which you raised about is the financial markets different? And of course, as I said, I'm not a financial market specialist, and I'm a bit cautious now. But when you threw out the bite, I have to take it or try to take it or start some discussion. But I would argue that they are. Is it really different, or is it just that, in a way, the technology and the instruments and the possibilities to have such fast markets make them work in a way that it's so much more difficult to control them? And in that way, they are not different in quality. It's more about speed and perhaps also, what would you call it, quantity or something, that it's so much faster market.
That's a good distinction.
Yeah.
Martin, do you want to reply?
Just very briefly. So this is, of course, obviously thought from Danish capitalism, and there would be variations, of course, of how this pattern would develop over time. But I would just think that if you have an unregulated financial sector, the probability that you will end up in a financial crisis should be, larger than if you have a restricted situation where the financial sector would be regulated. But that's of course that's extremely interesting if you have other cases. If you can show that in Finland there's so bad regulation of the financial sector that even sort of to restrict the financial sector created a crisis. That's difficult for me to just grasp that right away. But it's interesting. Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, it was when they deregulated the market. The actors couldn't act in the market.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay, I give the word to Erik Lakoma.
Thank you. This is an interesting discussion. I think that the basic takeaway, which I barely mentioned but should have been mentioned, is that regardless if you define something as a market or not, or an organized market or an emergent ordered market, you have still actors that respond to incentives. And if you want to analyze this picture, for example, or the general discussion, is that what would happen is that also the politicians respond to incentives. And companies or individual as economic actors could in every occasion choose which way they want to pursue. They could actually, if they're in their interest, to lobby for a regulation that would benefit them, or a tariff, or a subsidy, or the ban for the competitor. They would do that if this is more profitable than producing more or cheaper goods and services. So incentives matter, and you can use them to analyze both these sectors. So there's no distinction when you analyze them, but you could see that, okay, you will have different outcomes if the institutions are different, or if the incentives are different, but the actors will respond. They are not different, because they are the same.
Thank you. I give the word to Montserrat Carbonell.
Isabel Polanyi, perhaps better, perhaps.
Okay,
in the dinner.
Okay. Peter?
Yeah. I would like to bring the discussion back to early modern times again, and not so technical. I think in one respect, financial markets are quite different from other markets, and it is in their consequences. As states manage to tap into financial markets, it has immense consequences for how wars were fought. Huge human resources were released into organized violence. Larger parts of the resources of society were sort of deployed as armed conflict. And also these also had reflects on all other parts of society. And in particular, I would like to stress the build up in the 18th century of navies, and which of course ended with Royal Navy ruling the world. But and I think this is very, very important aspect that we need to take on. They're not just producing good things for people. They are also causing immense human sufferings and wastage of resources in the form of organized violence. But on the other hand, organized violence also brings new economic benefits. New groups benefit from that. You get more sort of the circulation in the economy increases and so forth. But I don't think we should sort of take warfare out of the discussion here.
Thank you. I give the word to Martin Shanahan.
Thank you. I was actually going to make a very similar point there, that in fact it's easy to overlook, violence is not quite the right word, but it's the disruption and the tension that's involved. We only have records to look at because somebody has had a dispute and they've written down that dispute and they've decided they need to work it out. We've heard about the financial connection between warfare and financial markets. And it occurred to me when I was looking at the diagram that sometimes it's a massive disruption like a war that causes a big shift in a structure and causes, and this is the incentives changing, this is the who wins and who loses changes. So I think there's a dimension there that we should not perhaps forget, and maybe it's even worth exploring a little more to see where that takes us.
Thank you very much. I think it's time to give the word to the audience. Is there anybody who wants to ask a question? Anne McCann, please.
Do I speak loudly enough? Is it okay?
You could have.
Okay. Yeah, this is dangerous. I've been thinking as I've been listening to this that we use the word market all the time these days for everything, really as a shorthand for transactions. And it seems to me that to be human is to be transactional. So we could just say, well, there's a market for everything, right? So, there's a marriage market, which I have to say is one of my least favorite things that economists talk about. But I mean, there's a market for, toenail cleaning and a market for louse removal, and right, there's a market for all of these things potentially, but then the word market doesn't mean much anymore. And maybe we should stop using it for everything and just say that, to be human is to be social. To be social means that you're involved in transactions. And those transactions will have all kinds of mediums. And some of those mediums are, what the Greeks would have thought of as, the pertaining to the oikos and therefore economic. And we should just let them continue to be I don't know. This is a little bit of a rant. But it seems to me that, and maybe in response to Bruce's question, financial markets have a sort of a clear meaning, and the market for grain has a clear meaning. But to sort of say everything is a market just because it involves transactions makes the whole concept less meaningful.
So does it make a difference that where property rights fit in? So you mentioned a marriage market, and presumably, hopefully, there are no property rights that are involved there, at least not anymore. So without property rights, we can have a transaction, but can we have a market?
And for me, your question raises a very important one, is when does the market stop? What does the market does not consider or should not consider? And this is the big question. There is a discussion from the Middle Ages about the public goods, and the public goods are not supposed to enter into the market. And the first public good was humanitas, the right to live. And it was taken again among the public goods in the encyclopedia in the 18th century, among the air, and there is, so there is a discussion on that. And one of the logic of the market is to marketize everything. And the other logic is it's individualistic and it is short term. So, we need to take all that on board to fight against, to control the limit of the market. And we need one can't study the market without study what are the boundaries.
Okay, I give the word to Yasser Abbas.
And I give you the microphone.
Now I was thinking to respond to you, Bruce. Instead of property rights, can we not think of earlier markets as controlled by trust, norms, and culture, in a sense, instead of that of property rights? That it could be socially awkward to do something that's now controlled by property rights and modern law, in a sense.
Could be.
Okay, I give the word to Livio de Matteo.
Well, I'm thinking of this morning when Carol did her presentation, and this is sort of like 9 academics and the elephant, in terms of, what is a market and what is a market like. I mean, a market is all those things. They're restricted, they're unrestricted, they're planned, unplanned, there's many players, few players, centralized, decentralized. But is there one defining concept of what a market is? Is a market an arrangement where trade occurs? And these are all variants around that. I mean, that's the only thing I want to throw out.
Somebody? Anybody? Eric?
Actually, I agree in principle that it could be, but then we end up in this, why don't we call all social sciences human action? Because we need to have narrower terms sometimes. I agree with Luc von Mises that you could call it human action instead of economics, but it doesn't really make sense if you can't be able to differentiate between sociology and economics. And the same goes with trade. It is. It could be more. It's like mentioned transaction. I agree with you that we can't. If we call everything as is interaction as a market, we could do that. That's possible, but it's not very useful.
Okay, I'll give the word to Philip Hoffman.
As I hear this, I think about, and I want to say this. I agree with Laurence Fontaine that everything is in some sense embedded. You have to pay very close attention to the context. I also am not really wild about Polanyi because he was in a context. But leaving that aside, I have a number of colleagues who strip away the context of human behavior and do experiments. And they are, there's one anthropologist, these would be economics experiments, a bunch of political scientists, but they do economic experiments, and a bunch of economists. But there's only one of them who does experiments on markets. The others don't. They do experiments on human behavior broadly defined. And I was trying to think, what's different about Charlie Plott's experiments? And I can't put my finger on it except that we had a series of talks about all this stuff. And one of the talks was by a guy named Vernon Smith, who won a Nobel Prize in economics for basically creating experimental economics. And he was talking about, he's talking about markets. These are, and what was distinctive seemed to be he had a bunch of people involved, not maybe just two. In any case, he, again, strips away the context and everything. You're having experiments probably with undergraduates, not a great subject pool. Okay, that's the kind of, we leave that aside. And he noted two striking differences. One is markets, no matter what the subject pool, I mean, he could do this with other subject pools, if it involves a good where there are no problems of quality and there's no transaction across time, okay, it's not a durable good, not a financial contract across time, anybody can find an equilibrium price in this market, which I still haven't defined, and that's great. What happens if that's not the case? Again, a market, a bunch of people involved, students. If it involved a transaction across time or questions of quality, it wasn't just a gallon of gasoline or a kilogram of wheat, then you could provoke all kinds of horrendous things, even in this sort of fixed context undergraduate experiment. You could have bubbles, you could all have kinds of stuff, and it was horribly unpredictable. He then went on to take a real example, the mortgage market in the US, and anyway, so the characteristics seem to be lots of people involved, price behavior, but prices can do very different things when holding the context constant when it's a good that whose quality or is uncertain, or whether you're trading across time. I don't know if that just further disturbs the discussion or not, but I'll shut up.
I just want to clarify, I'm not high on Polanyi either, but I thought he really prompted a vibrant discussion about markets. But I'll paraphrase that markets know the price of everything, but the value of nothing. That's usually applied to economists, so I just adapted it a little bit.
Thank you. More questions or subjects? Håkan?
Well, for me, we have a word, we say market, and this word is used in a lot of contexts. And I think we have to accept that. I mean, if we use it everyday word, then we have to define what we mean as a concept when we use it. And I think that is the important thing. And in that respect, I think we have, in all times we have different markets at the same time. And I can't see the Polanyi thing that markets develop in one direction, and I can't see the development here in one direction either in history. Because they are layers, they are different things at the same time. I mean, you have the state, the marine, build-up of the marine in the 18th century. It was important. It created new markets, and the state became important in those financial markets. At the same time, you had this small peer-to-peer lending, what do you ever want to call it, the parish bankers, which at the same time you worked on the market. You have to just define what you mean, and then it's all right for me.
Somebody who wants to reply to that question in the panel? Martin?
Okay, yeah. So I see what you mean, Håkan, but I also think there have been differences between market circumstances over time. So as I was trying to explain with that, these four variations would be what is the relationship between actually corporate strategies and market circumstances. And of course, there's been differences between various sort of, let's say, the beer market and the shipping market and the financial market. But there has been specific time periods that, but you can say the overall type of situation, the overall type of markets has been dominated, for instance, by cartels, or by planned economy, by a strong state, or by more common markets. And that, I think that has real consequences for the way that you can conduct business and also the way that individuals can behave in these different time periods and different places.
Okay, I give the word to Craig Muldrup.
Yeah, perhaps muddying the waters even further, but I wanted to raise a question about another concept, probably equally important to markets, which we almost always now associate with markets, which is profit. So I would imagine most, when we're thinking of modern markets, you're thinking of making some kind of profit, and the more the better, I guess, if you're the Jeff Bezos or whatever. But you can certainly have a market where you go and bargain, and you make a little bit one day, you make a little bit, lose a little bit the next day, and you don't actually make much profit over time. So is it worth considering the concept of profit together with markets, or separate but related? So that's just a question. And then going back to the much earlier discussion about our financial markets different, I think one thing that wasn't raised is, of course, they are pretty much exclusively markets in nothing, in a sense. There's no molecules involved. Their value is just abstract value. Of course, at some point, there's a concept there will be some goods or services, and of course, markets in goods and services aren't immediately barter markets, but they're perhaps more anchored to the materialization of the goods or services at a closer point in time to the value. So just 2 points.
Thank you. Somebody wants to reply or comment on this? No?
Sorry.
Yeah, Carol. So.
The market is closed.
I don't think Jeff Bezos makes profits. That's exactly what he's not about.
Market share. Maybe we come.
Market share, not profit. So I mean, that pose some problems because Amazon does have a great share price, but.
Right. Yeah. Muddying even further. Yeah.
Yes. Somebody more? Susanna Fellman? No. Hans Sjögren?
Yes, I could think of a question for a historian. I think it's very important that we look.
Wait a minute.
Yes. And have a microphone.
Yeah.
Just a tiny comment. I think for a business historian and economic historian, I think it's very important to raise the issue how new markets are created, always, because that happens all the time, that new markets are created by entrepreneurs on a low level, but I mean, gradually they will develop new markets. And how are they developed? And then at a certain time, we could see, well, they are embedded in different institutions and behavior and so on. But how do entrepreneurs create these markets? How do they see the windows of opportunity? That is very interesting because, yeah, we could look at these markets and statistically we can see the value of them and so on.
Martin seems to.
I'll do that very, very briefly. That's an interesting question, Hans, but I don't. So I think it more in the sense that entrepreneurs are exploiting markets than they are creating markets. If that makes sense to you, does that make any sense to you? Saying that. So they are looking in here and then they're saying, well, in this situation, this context, what I could do would be this and that, and then I could create a profit. Was that?
Yeah, but maybe I miss position here because, of course, the entrepreneur is creating a company, and that company will exploit a market. Yeah. But without the company or without having a supply, it will not be any market. So it starts with the entrepreneur, I think, creating a firm, and then... That's a deep question.
Well,
so, Susanna, perhaps the last word.
I mean, I think here we're starting coming to the higher splitting. It's creating and exploiting. Exploiting opportunities, creating markets in a way that you. But I think that you are onto something that if you don't have somebody who supplies something and somebody who demands something, then we have a new market, and then you create it. But you also create it through then behavior change over time, so it's not a stable market, it changes and so on. So in that way, it's also a creation process all the time. But they also exploit, of course, the opportunity, but that then creates a market.
Okay, very short, Eric.
Yeah, just one short comment. I agree with your point, but this is what I said about organized market and emergent market. You should probably not use the word what you said, created, because then you can't differentiate if this is organized top down or that they have emerged. And I think most markets actually would emerge, not being designed. So, but this is better. There you can have a distinction, but create could be both.
Okay. I will give the last word to the man in the back. A second, and this is the last word.
Thank you. My name is Tino Sanandaji. I'm an economist at HFF, and I'm going to get the last word, so nobody gets the rebuttal. Can say anything as stupid as I want. But I think that I'm an economist, so I see this as an economist. But I think that you can really reconcile all of this quite easily. First of all, you were mentioning Werner Smith. It's a market when you have a supply and a demand, and you coordinate on a price, and the price affects quantity. And the key element is that people coordinate on this. Even in tribes, if people have done experiments in hunter-gatherer tribes, you can create markets. But you're not going to create markets if the social construction, when you coordinate on something, if there are people fragmented doing transactions, it's not a market. If it's a marriage situation when in Kurdistan everybody marries their cousin, it's not a market. It's a market, marriage market, if the different individuals are somehow competing with each other in a coordinated way. And the only thing you need to define it is you have a shadow price or a price, and you have supply and demand. And a lot of transactions are not done that way. If you have a super feudal society, it's meaningless. Or a Soviet economy, they had prices, but the prices didn't determine quantity, so it wasn't a market. And I have a great deal of respect for historian perspectives that in some situations in history, we didn't really, it was not real markets as we would have talked about them. And going to Hans' point as well, it also becomes a market if this element that you determine things using supply, demand, and coordinate and price and quantity, if it becomes very institutionalized, formalized, and everybody can use it, then then you have created a market. So if we also, and the question becomes, why is it so easy to create markets? Goes back to both Eric's point and what the gentleman said about Vernon Smith. It's just enough. People seem to be able to do this very, very, very easily. If you put 10 students and you give them a simple good, or if people have done experiments with hunter-gatherers, you just give them a simple good, it's extremely easy to create markets. So it seems to be an element of human nature, and at least for simple goods, and just enough to have some rationality and self-interest.
Thank you. This was the last comment. We have had a really stimulating roundtable and a stimulating day. And I will not even try to conclude this roundtable. And I also believe that this discussion about markets will continue during the dinner. And now it's 5:30, and I would like us all to give us an applause, and especially the panel, of course. And I believe that Håkan is now inviting us to dinner.
Yes, in half an hour. You are free for half an hour. Do what you want. I hope we'll continue the discussion, actually. But at 6 o'clock, the dinner will be served in the atrium. We go upstairs and then to the left when you go outside. 1/4 of the atrium is ours tonight, and we'll no sitting. Well, of course we are sitting, but it's no planned sitting. You are free to join your friends, and my hope is that not all Swedes will be at one table and all US people in another table. So try to mix, please, blended together. Thank you very much for today. It was a lovely discussion.